there.
So now let's move on and talk about the Electoral College. So there are so many questions about it, and I'm going to tell you a lot of digging to be able to look at what exactly the process is and how does it exactly work. So where have we already come? November 3rd, ostensibly the votes are counted. We've already know there's a lot of problems there, but from a procedural standpoint, the governors in the weeks after the election create a certificate of ascertainment. That certificate says these are the electors for this party, these are the electors for this party, and here are the number of votes for each of them that were cast for that party. So that's, people kind of get a little misconception about the vote. The vote is not for specifically the president. It is for the party who then has electors who will cast their votes, ostensibly for the candidate. So the vote of ascertainment signed by the governors, those have been done, those have been sent in. You can go to the Electoral College website and look those up, literally looked at them. And then the thing that comes that's most important from yesterday, or Monday rather, was the December 14th deadline for the certificate of the vote. And that's when the electors actually come in, cast their votes, and then that is sealed under the United States Code. That's actually sealed before it goes out. That's 3 U.S.C. 15 in the United States Code. And that eventually kind of makes its way over the next 2 weeks through Congress, archivists, and eventually to the floor of the House. And that's where the president of the Senate, our very own Vice President Pence, who, as a quick reminder, did great in his debates, loved it.
Other than the fly. The fly, he had Flygate.
Hey, you know what? I was just paying more attention to him with Flygate. I think, I'm not one to say that everything is intentional, but I think
it's really a Pied Piper thing.
The
Flarks just realized how good he was.
So now on the floor, now we've got these votes that are unsealed. Those votes are going to be read. The president of the Senate, so Vice President Pence, will sit there, count the talliers, say, hey, we're going to get some people from each party to be counting these. We will unseal them and read them. And in past years, this has taken as short as 21 minutes to just run through. When there's just no question, you open it up, boom, done.
You're done.
There's no question about what these look like. So we've had a few different, we'll get to some of the exceptions over history. Man, I don't know the number of times I've heard people say, oh, that's never happened in American history. And I'm like, actually, that happened 5 times, and then this other thing happened 3 times. This other thing actually already happened once 100 years ago.
Well, if it happened, I would know about it, Bill. So
because
I'm a
CNN would tell me.
Okay, nothing happened before I was
Look, I looked in the entire Vox archive, and I did not find
they didn't
anything
have one video
about the election from 1876 with Robert Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio.
No, that's pretentious.
So back to the Electoral College. So when it gets there, what happens? People are like, okay, well, is this the point somebody does something? Is this the point somebody does something? Okay, this is the point where somebody can do something. So a written objection under the United States Code that governs the Electoral College process on the floor of the House, a written objection that has to be signed in writing by 1 representative and 1 senator. It will then go to be debated, and there's time limits on that debate, to see whether or not the objections are valid. So then, of course, people are going, well, of course, this is the time. You bring in all the evidence, and you go, look, voter fraud. There's a limitation on what you can actually object to. In that moment, you can object to 2 things. And then there's a third extra one. Vote regularly given by a lawfully certified elector. So you can point to either of those 2 things as being defective. If someone didn't do a vote that they should have done under the normal process, or was someone not a lawfully certified elector. So if these votes come out and there are objections to the votes, the chambers will go back to the respective homes and say, hey, we're going to debate it amongst themselves. So now people will say, who makes the decision? Okay, well, this is the moment where it's still majority. Majority of the House by representative, majority of the Senate will decide, are they going to sustain the objection, which means approve the objection and discount the vote? Or if they disagree, the votes still count. So you have to have both of those. You have to have both the Senate and the House decide that an objection needs to go forward. That's going to be a pretty high standard.
Remind me, when does this happen? You said
this is January 6th.
January 6th,
okay. That's the deadline?
That's the day that these things happen, 1 p.m., January 6th.
Wow. We need to do a live stream.
It's coming up. It's coming up. Well, it is going to be very interesting, and it will be something that people should tune in on. Okay, so then now there's one other way that we actually have dealt with in the past in 1876, that Hayes election versus Tilden, conflicting designations. So 3 different states said, nah, those aren't our electors. These are our electors. And they both sent in conflicting ballots or conflicting certificates of vote. And in that moment, there was a little bit different term then because the certain statute wasn't in place. But in that moment, the Congress had to go, no, I don't know who it is.
Make a call.
Exactly.
I'm not sure who it is. And ultimately, they decided to throw out enough votes to take the person who had not won, Hayes, and put him up by one electoral vote.
Yeah.
And that decision was made by both the House and the Senate together. So there is still a path in which, when the evidence of fraud, let's go all the way back to the lawsuits we're talking about. Why do all these things matter? Why would people spend so much time, energy, and money to hire experts, gather evidence, to bring these suits? It's because ultimately, if none of those prove fruitful through the court system, you still have the ability of these electors to have made a different decision with their sealed votes, or for the House and the Senate to look at the evidence that comes up by January 6th and go, wait a minute, these electors weren't lawfully certified because they weren't the real electors that should have been sending this in. And in fact, we will accept a different set of electors if another set was sent, or we just won't count those electors' votes. So why does the 12th Amendment matter now? 12th Amendment says you have to have a majority of the Electoral College to be able to win.
Right. So 270, that's the number that we saw on election night that they were all talking about. And all of a sudden, if you take away Pennsylvania plus one other state, I think that puts Biden below or close. Pennsylvania, maybe a couple of swing states.
If he doesn't have all of those states and he doesn't get to 270, he doesn't win.
Right. And so I think the question that a lot of people have is, okay, so, on Monday when they were doing this on the 14th, they said, people got really excited, right? Garrett, we were talking about it before the show, that there were Republican electors selected in places like Arizona that have been called for Joe Biden. I think Pennsylvania and maybe Michigan as well selected Republican electors or some combination of swing states. How does that play into this? Do you know kind of what's going on there? Are they just basically keeping a door open just in case?
Well, the certificate of ascertainment actually lists all of the electors. Okay. So actually, if you look at it, it'll say for every single state, the forms are a little bit different because there's no prescribed form. They'll say electors for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, electors for President Trump and Vice President Pence, and it'll say the number of votes. So ultimately, most states' laws say if you have a plurality of the votes within the state, then that party's electors get to then cast the votes on December 14th, and that is what ostensibly happened. However, there is still some precedent to say on January 6th, when they get these votes in, if there is such an overwhelming evidence of fraud, they could make a decision that these votes weren't lawfully given or the electors were not lawfully certified.
Right. And so I think in 1876, one of the things that happened, and I'm not going to give the specific because I'll be called out by somebody on it, but I think you had...
I'll call you out.
So from a particular state, right, like Florida was one of the states that was contested, you had them, had the governor that basically sent electors and said, here's their certificate. And then you had the legislature that sent electors, and they signed something else, and that created the problem at that point, right?
Correct.
And so that's what happened in 1876, where there was a debate because there was rampant fraud, there was voter intimidation. In one state, I think there was 101% turnout. Does that sound familiar?
It was
also 1876 had the highest voter turnout in history. I think it was 88.1% of registered voters voted in 1876.
Wow.
A lot of similarities to what's been going on here. And so I think that creates this situation where then we have an issue, right? When you get two slates of electors that are sent from, call it Georgia, right? And they say, hey, how do we decide this? Who's the real ones?
And now what we haven't seen is that there's actually been, and I have not seen this yet reported, and it might be something that's happening because the votes are sealed or it's outside of the process. But if ultimately Congress has in its hands on January 6th conflicting electoral votes, that's when we get to this different process.
Right.
So actually, the situation in 1876 was South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. They submitted certificates of elections for both candidates from different authorities. Since that time, people are going to go, oh, look, there it is. Well, since then, Congress, actually passed a law that changes how that process looks. So there's actually a process for deciding who is the appropriate authority to send that in. It's a little bit more complicated. Long story short, it's a little bit harder to just send in. Right. It's not like we could just get together and go, we decided that the other electors win.
We can print off a certificate. Sure? Come on.
There's a higher threshold there, but still a path in which the different electors would actually be nullified. So I don't think it's going to be a situation where in 1876 you had conflicting electors.
Right.
It's going to be a moment where you say these electors who were rightfully selected didn't cast their vote correctly, or they just weren't. You're not going to replace them. You're just going to not count them at all, and then you can't get to that majority under the 12th Amendment.
I have a question. So if Biden goes down to like 253, and then Trump is like 236, what happens there?
There we go.
It's a good question.
That is what we would call a contingent election. So without having enough votes, now we have to decide who's going to make that decision, and that's where it goes to the House to do votes. Okay. This vote, then, is each state casting one vote.
Yeah, equal weight.
Period. So it's not the number of House of Representatives, which strongly favors Democrats, even after some historic losses. Right. Their words. Yeah.
That's true.
Not trying to rub it in, but I'm rubbing it in.
Yeah. I mean, you like the words, though.
They're great words.
It's their words.
They're the best
You gotta
words.
use their words.
You know, the best use of a silent H ever. Okay, the historic vote. So each state casts one vote. So in 1800 and 1824, we actually had elections that were decided by the House. This is not an unusual thing. And so what happens there, what the commentators are saying, what we're looking at the votes would be, is that President Trump would actually have 26 states. So in the event of a contingent election where each state gets one vote in the House, there would be enough votes to say this is the actual winner of the election. Okay. So there's about 5 different things that have to happen. Yeah. Each one of those has a very small margin of chance to be able to get in. Mm-hmm. But notice, here's the thing. We've talked about this being a Trump versus Biden type scenario, but this is what the law is, which is why you're hearing, even this morning, Hillary Clinton calling for the abolishment of the Electoral College.
Right.
Because what it does is the checks and balances in that system are what allow us to even be in a situation to challenge the fraud that we've seen in the election. And now they're realizing, oh man, all of this democracy and procedural fairness is dang it. Might come back to bite. We thought we had this thing in the bag when Anderson Cooper said we won. Anderson, I thought you said we won.
Right. Yeah. Well, no, and that's I think a really valid point, because we have seen the Electoral College come under attack and people not really understand why don't you just take like the popular vote, because it makes a lot of sense, right? You have a popular vote, and whatever the will of the people is, you can argue that then you have big cities basically making the decisions and not really representing the rural voters, and so kind of giving that some weight. But it's also for this, like I think the founders of this country knew enough to know that they didn't know everything. And it was great that they put in these protections to make sure, like, hey, if we have fraud, how do we deal with that on a national level? If we have a fraud issue in a state that isn't resolved in that state, how do we then deal with that? How do we deal with people not being represented in rural areas? And coming up with the Electoral College, as convoluted as it may seem sometimes, is a fantastic idea. And it is everything that you just described, by the way. If it happens, it's completely constitutional. It is exactly what they intended to have happen in a situation where fraud was obvious.
Exactly. And you're trying to create a system that can survive the test of time. So you don't have to move the goalposts all the time. But that is what the Democrats are trying to do right now. They want to move the goalposts to further ensure that they will never have to deal with answering for fraud in the future again. Yeah. And that might benefit them now, but when the shoe is on the other foot, everyone's going to want to know, is the core of our democracy and our republic built on the ability to say, I looked for the fraud and we found the answer, and if there was, we dealt with it, and if there wasn't, we all fucking moved on. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but I'm going to say it.
Well, you said it. So, it happened.
Okay. So here's the end game, and here's what I want to tell you. The reason why you must still continue to harangue all of your different senators, Republicans, or Democrat, your House representatives, even at the state level, your governors, your Secretary of States, is because this country needs to know what exactly happened during these elections. Whether or not it changes the course of the actual election, whether or not the progressive left and mainstream media have already set this out so far that we cannot do anything from a matter of practicum, because by the time we figure out this fraud, we're already a year into the Biden-Kamala doomsday presidency. It is what it is, but we still have a country beyond that. We still have kids and grandkids who need to know that this country will fight to understand what is going on with our elections and to be able to improve them for the future. Even if there's only a small chance that that will happen, we have to continue to make that fight. So continue to make sure to write and call and just be real annoying to every single person who might have any influence between now and January 6th, and even after January 6th. Even if it turns out that Vice President Pence has to cast that final decision based on the electoral votes for the opponent, for Biden and for Harris, this republic will survive. I mean, we're definitely going to survive Biden. I mean, that guy's not going to make it through the first year. But we'll definitely survive Kamala, President Kamala Harris.
Watch Good Morning Mug Club live every Monday through Thursday at 10:15 Eastern.